Hi, this is the NewSpace India podcast, and in this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, we have Aravind Ravichandran, who's based out of France. Welcome, Aravind, to the show.
Thanks, NP. Thanks for having me on.
You have done like quite a lot of things in the space industry. Jumping up from being in the software industry, then to getting into the space industry with consulting and so on. I get quite a lot of questions around young people trying to enter the space industry, especially from India, given that there are quite a little number of opportunities for them beyond ISRO at the moment. So I wanted to take this episode to chat a little bit about how do you get into the space industry, what would be your experience. So to kick off this conversation, why don't we begin by having you tell us about your journey into the space industry.
Sure. So I was already living in Europe, so I didn't move to Europe for the space industry. So it's a bit different. So I was fortunate that I was already in Europe and I was able to have the exposure and start meeting people already in Europe. But I was working in Berlin at that time in the software industry, and I had met a few people in a conference, and they had mentioned about International Space University in a conversation, and I just got curious and I checked it out, and it happened to be, a university that basically, has a program, a summer program, and as well as a one-year program that helps people get into the space industry by giving them, fundamentals of the space industry. Well, they call it the master's program. It's mostly, an introduction program into space, which is kind of set up like a master's. So I did that. I left my job. I decided to do that, and I did that 4 years ago, I think. And yeah, during the program, you're introduced into all the facets of space. As most of us know, but probably people outside the space industry wouldn't know that space industries, has different disciplines. You can be a lawyer in the space industry, you can be an economist in the space industry, you can be, of course, the engineer and the scientist, and the medicine part of it. So we were all introduced to all these domains. So it was a very good course for people who are outside the industry like me to get into the industry, to get the fundamentals of what's going on in the space industry. And then I kind of chose my career because I was in the business side of things when I was in the software industry. So I decided to position myself in the consulting role. So I joined uh, PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. They have a space team, so I joined their space team in the consulting team, and I decided to specialize myself in the Earth observation domain. The part of space, for listeners who wouldn't know, the part of space that deals with monitoring the Earth through satellites in space. So I decided to specialize in that, and because you're working in consulting, you work in other projects as well. So that was kind of my entry into the space industry, and I decided to specialize in Earth observation simply because I came from the software world, and I see Earth observation as just another source of data that is coming from space. So yeah, I decided to specialize there, and that's how it got started.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. So, one of the questions that I keep getting from a lot of young people in India is what is the entryway into the space industry, either within India or outside of India? And a lot of the people have this perception that they need to study, like satellite dynamics or astrodynamics or something related to core satellite engineering. And often I see that maybe 90% of the jobs that are out there, they can just need basic foundation engineering but applied to space. So what is your sense of what is the breakup of the kind of roles and the kind of jobs that are out there in terms of percentages of jobs that are out there and the skill sets that are needed for them and the opportunities for them?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, from a geographic perspective, obviously, if you're looking at the number of jobs are, of course, they are higher outside India than ones in India, because the ones in India are limited to ISRO and a few new space companies that are coming up. So that's the companies that you have already had on the podcast, I suppose. So in India, those are the kind of jobs, and of course the numbers are 10 times more if you compare it to Europe. So the from a skill set standpoint, it's really not needed, because I keep telling people, even when people I meet, people when they ask me, it's just not needed to have an aerospace engineering degree to get into the space industry. More, lot of jobs don't really require that. All you need to know is engineering. So if you look at it from just three perspective, or let's say four. One, I can call it the business domain, where everything to do with consulting, analyst, marketing, um, and writing and all that. That can be one category, the business category, and then there is the technical category, or the engineering category, where everything to do with systems engineering to satellite manufacturing, assembly and testing, managing the manufacturing process, etc. So the technical side, and then there is the third and the fourth side, which is kind of rare. The third side being the lawyer side, where everything to do with space policy, and then the fourth one being the medicine part of it. Of course, the third and the fourth category, the lawyer and the medicine category, are very, very rare. Of course, you need to do plenty of research. You can't really, it's very rare that you can get a job as a space lawyer, but that's not impossible to do. There are a couple of people who specialize in law and who have transitioned into the space industry. That's still possible. And the same with medicine. You can have a medicine degree and you can be interested in space, and then you can move on to doing some research on how the human body behaves in space and all that. So, but the third and fourth category are pretty rare, so I'm not going to focus on that. But for the first and the second category, there's a lot more jobs in the engineering and the business discipline than what people think. Like you rightly pointed out, all you need to know is basics of engineering, and if you know how to if you've studied any sort of engineering, it can be electrical, it can be automotive, it can be instrumentation. The fundamentals of that remain the same. In the space industry's case, the only addition comes from the fact that the product that you're manufacturing or testing is going to be in space. So the only basics that you need to understand is the foundations of space. So you can do that via online course. It's as simple as that today. You don't even need to do a full-fledged degree, but like I said, you can look out for schools like ISU and do a summer program, which I know a lot of people have already started doing to get into the space industry. So that can already give you an idea. So from a numbers perspective, I do believe that the engineering jobs are more frequently available than the business jobs, because the business jobs tend to be very specialized, like I said, in product marketing, in consulting, as a market analyst, etc. So myself, I'm an independent consultant right now. So, and there are a couple of companies in Europe, a couple of companies in the US, which do have consulting positions that they recruit for. But it's not, if I have to give a percentage, I would say it's 90% in the engineering side and 10% in the business side. But the 10% can look small, but if I'm being real, the number of people who want to get into the engineering side is anyway higher than the number of people who are interested in the business side of things, if you know what I mean. So it's not impossible to get a job, if you want to get into, if you're already a consultant and you just want to get into the space industry, or if you're already, I don't know, a marketing person and you want to get into the space industry, all you need to know is, the fundamentals of space, how the space industry works, and also what's going on in the space industry, listening to podcasts, reading the news. And then you just get yourself up to date. And I can tell you that I already have seen people make the change. I have seen people who were in doing marketing for, I don't know, a software company, transitioning to doing marketing for a space company, or even consulting. I've seen people who were studying economics or law, transitioning into consulting. So even though I say it's a 90-10 split between technical and business, there are still some jobs available if you approach it smartly. That's kind of how I would put it.
In that sense, when you talk about the numbers in India, for example, can you take a wild guess, for example, as to how many jobs are created in India, for example, including, let's say, in the new space startups or SMEs or ISRO for that matter, for the space industry? Do you have any sense of it?
Yeah, in the Indian space industry, the number of jobs, there are, I think there are close to 20,000 people working in the Indian space industry overall, or at least in ISRO overall, and probably a few more thousands in the private industry. But this number is just only going to grow in the next few years because of the privatization happening right now. For those following the Indian space policy, there are bills to privatize the Indian space industry more, which means that the jobs that are going to be available in private companies are going to get higher. So that's from the public demand side, and also from just from the new space side. I mentioned before, there are a number of new space companies coming up, and they are starting to recruit actively as well, because companies like Pixel and Dhruva Aerospace and Agnicool, they're all they all got VC investments in the past few months, meaning they are going to grow. They're going to need people. So there's definitely a lot of jobs. That's again on the engineering side. But I would argue for every 10 jobs creator, there's going to be at least one that is going to be on the business side of things, or the legal side of things, because these are all things that are essential. You cannot operate without a business person, or or a person with a legal knowledge. That is going to get very, very important in the next few years as well, and obviously those ones require experience. So those are ones that are probably not going to be great for people who just have got out of university, or have just a couple of years. So for people who have experience in the legal side of things, and the business side of things, strategy, business development, marketing, they are all going to be available as well, because from a startup standpoint, or from the private industry standpoint, you do need to do a lot of business development once this company starts growing. So there's going to be demand for them as well. So in India's case, I think the engineering jobs are going to be more and more available. So for people in India, it's a good time to get into the space industry, I think.
From my own understanding in the last 10 years or so, having tracked a lot of these young companies come up and be invested, the whole investment phenomena, of course, is only happening in the last 2 or 3 years, with major institutional investors coming and investing in new space startups. And I guess today a fair number to say is that there are about 500 people who are working in all of these new space companies put together, apart from the SMEs that already work with ISRO in that sense. And the recruitment numbers for ISRO maybe something like 350 or something like that maximum per year. So, and even if the SMEs are taking up new people it may not be more than like 200, 300 people. So in my own assessment, I feel like there's probably 1,000 jobs created in India by all of these companies, and including ISRO put together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's definitely only going to, go towards the 1,000 side, rather than going down towards the 500 side, simply because we have a lot of, space missions coming up, and yeah, the demand is going to go because they're going to privatize it, and it's I think, like I said, it's probably a good time to get into the Indian space industry, because there's going to be more need in the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. And for anybody who is, let's say, doing an undergraduate degree in India, for example, today, what would be a pathway, beyond the Indian industry, beyond local opportunities in India? Is it easy for somebody to, graduate and immediately get into a European company or an American company? or how easy is it for them to transition to other geographies in the space industry?
That's a very important question because that's something what a lot of people do want to do simply because there's not enough opportunities in India available for all the enthusiasts for the space industry. I would say, well, just on the outset, that if past an undergraduate degree that you want to get a job, it is probably easier to do that in Europe than in the US, simply because of the US space projects and missions being restricted, or most of them being restricted to ITAR, the legal or the law that that does not allow non-US citizens to work on space-related missions and space-related companies. And unfortunately, most of the space companies in the US have a relationship with NASA or the US DoD, which means that they are subjected to ITAR, and hence the requirement is to have at least a US citizenship. So that's kind of unfortunate. Although I wouldn't say that's case for all the space companies or all the opportunities in the US industry, but most of them tend to be that case. Whereas in Europe, well, there are also a lot of startups in the US that people can get to, but simply just also from a visa perspective, I mean, at the time of this recording in November, we think that it's going to be a new administration in the US, and probably it's going to get easier to get jobs and move to the US. So the non-ITAR requiring jobs probably have they have a chance, but you still have some visa strict visa requirements to get through. But in Europe, I think it's getting easier and easier. At least based on how it has been in the last few years, things could change in the next year or so because of COVID, and how the legal implications change. But Europe is definitely easier, simply because there's I wouldn't say easy access, but easier access compared to the US right now. And the in terms of jobs, of course, the US industry has more jobs for the space industry than Europe. But whatever is addressable for the Indian market is probably higher in Europe. There are a lot of companies that one can get into. Of course, getting into working for European Space Agency is not possible, but you can get into the contractors that build the spacecraft for European missions. People can do their do their internships or get a job in companies like Airbus or OHB or the NewSpace companies as well. So it's definitely possible or easier to get into the European space industry. And once you've passed the undergraduate degree, I think all it requires is to kind of have an ambition of where you want to work in, because that's where having an understanding of the space industry works. Because if your interest is in systems engineering and you want to work in, I don't know, communication related companies, or you just want to work in a space company in systems engineering, that is already better than having an idea of, I want to get into working for a space company. So it's important to kind of have an idea of which section of space or which domain of space interests you. For some people, it's exploration, but unfortunately, there are not a lot of exploration companies. There are a few, and then you can see how you can target them. But it's important to have. That's what I always tell people, to have a kind of a interest based on their profile, what kind of domain they want to get into. So if you're an engineer and you want to do work in communication subsystems, or if you want to work in it can be the whole systems engineering thing. It's already better than then you can have a list of companies that you can look at, and you can look for jobs and look for portals. But then if you just want to get into the space industry, that is too general, and you will not be able to target specifically. So it's important to have a domain of interest at the outset that matches with your profile, of course, because you can't get into an exploration company if your background is in communications engineering. Do you know what I mean? So it's important to have a realistic ambition as well.
Yeah, those are, I think, extremely good insights. Beyond, the Europe and the US geography, do you have a sense of what would be like opportunities, let's say in Canada, Australia, Japan, or many, many other geographies, maybe the Middle East or so on?
Yeah, no, definitely. The Middle East is an interesting case because the space industry is growing a lot in the Middle East. For people who've been tracking the events in the last few years, there have been multiple missions from the UAE, and there's space agencies established in other countries as well, in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, and it's a good time to be in the space industry. But then one has to realize that it's a national space agency. Although there can be a couple of companies there, it's still mostly national space agencies, meaning it is restricted to citizens. So you can do you can get some type of jobs, but you cannot get the main job, because it's for the space agency. So Middle East case, but I do know people who have worked in the space industry in the Middle East, but not in great positions or full-time positions, simply because it's reserved for its local citizens. It's the case with any country. If you want to get to working for their space agency, it's not possible directly. And the upcoming countries like Middle East, it's hard to do that because most of the jobs available are in the space agency. Canada is an interesting case because Canada is kind of moving towards, moving away from the space agency model, and there's a lot of companies there, local companies. So Canada could be an interesting option, definitely, simply because it's also relatively easier to get into Canada from a visa perspective. There's a lot of companies being set up in Earth observation to lunar exploration to communications. Whatever domain you want, there are companies in Canada, meaning there are going to be jobs available soon. MDA is now back to Canada. There's Kepler, and there's Skywatch, and there are a couple of companies coming up in Canada. So Canada could be definitely an interesting um, destination to look at. But then, if you're looking at just undergraduate degree, perhaps it's also good to consider a master, just depending on what your interests are, because unless you've studied exactly what you want to work, it could be a little tricky, and maybe you would feel more comfortable doing a master's degree. And also, getting a job is easier if you have a master's degree from the local country. It can be in Europe, in Japan, in Canada, or even in the US. It's just easier if you do a master's degree. So it's not impossible to get a job with just bachelor's degrees, but it's probably advisable, especially for Indians, to have a master's degree, simply because they can kind of fill their knowledge gap, and also kind of get to know the local environment. So I think that applies to every country. And yeah, going back to your question, Japan is an interesting example again, like Canada, because there are companies coming up. That across different domains, from lunar exploration, high space, to space debris, and even Earth observation, Synspective. There are a few companies coming up there, but I think for Japan it's still kind of localized, and it's better if you know the language, and the preference tends to be for people who know how to speak the language. So it's probably kind of a harder destination, unless one knows Japanese already. So the smart thing would be to target an English speaking country, or where kind of English is tolerated, like Australia, which is also it's kind of nascent, it's still growing, but maybe Australia, or Canada, looking at a master's perspective, or Europe, if you're kind of aware of what you want to do. And again, going back to languages, in Europe, it's probably essential to know the language. I wouldn't say it's impossible to get a job without having a very high fluency of French or German or Spanish, but it's just very good to have that. If you're set that you want to go to Europe, then it's better to pick the language of your destination and start learning it. I wouldn't say you need to master it, but it could get very, very important. I mean, of course, the working language of ESA is English, and a lot of people who work in Airbus and OHB and the new space companies do entertain English, but then the language requirement also comes in Europe. When you're actually looking for a job, you don't want that to be the reason why you're not recruited. In some cases, that is actually a reason why people are not recruited. Because in Europe, some companies don't really worry about the visa. So, visa is not stopping you. And if the language is really the only reason that's stopping you, then, that's something that can be changed. So it's better to know the language in Europe. And, Japan is kind of an extreme example because you need to absolutely know the language and, in full fluency. So it could be harder, but in Europe, even if kind of intermediate in French or German, it puts you in a much better position to get a job than if you speak no French or German, because there's still jobs available, there's still demand for technical profiles, and there's a lot of demand expected in the next few years. So it's just better to know the language, especially if you're kind of set on moving to Europe. But other countries, I think it's especially Canada, US, and Australia, it's much more relaxed.
Yeah, that's a very good insight in that sense. So one of the things that people keep asking is if they can choose a particular area to do like a master's in, and then get into the industry as such. So in your opinion, is it good to get a master's degree or something like that for somebody who's getting out of an undergraduate degree to then get into the industry? Or do you suggest that if somebody has experience in some other sector in electronics, or in software design or so on, how easy is it for them to transition into the space industry directly without getting a space specific education?
It could be easy without having specific, space-related education, but at least I would recommend, some sort, simply because of the network. It's the space industry is a very small industry compared to any other industry in the world, and networks and connections go a very long way in getting a job. I myself got a job because I went to a conference and I was networking, and I happened to meet someone who was working in my previous company, and that helped me land the position. And that wouldn't have happened if I was just sitting at home and trying to apply for a job. Maybe I would not have been selected. So it's definitely recommended to be part of a community or a network. And there are two ways to doing it. One is to go and join the community, meaning do a master's program and get to know the space community locally, or do the ISU, for instance. That's one way of doing it. And of course, if you're doing that from India, it's harder to do it remotely. Well, today I think this is kind of how the world is, but still, it's easier if you're inside a network rather than an outsider trying to get into the industry. So it's definitely good to get into a community like that. But then there's also the perspective of where or what kind of domain you want to study in order to get into the space industry. But it simply depends on your own profile. If your profile is in software and you want to get into something that is completely unrelated, then it's absolutely necessary that you need to do a master's. If your background is in software and you want to get into an engineering domain, then it's absolutely essential that you do a master's degree in engineering, or aerospace engineering or space engineering in universities in whatever your country of interest is. But that becomes absolutely necessary if your background doesn't match with what you want to do. But then, if you have some sort of matching experience, like like we were discussing before, electrical engineering, um, electronics and communication, or aerospace, or instrumentation, whatever your undergraduate degree is in, you have more chances of landing a role if you do something in the space industry. So you can kind of align yourself to go even more in depth into a space domain. It can be it can be in, in systems engineering, or it can be in, if you're a software person and you want to get into satellite imagery and analyzing satellite data and all that, then you can do, degree focused on space applications, or, Earth observation and remote sensing. It's just about how you see or what kind of domain that you want to get into, and that's why, going back to the point I was mentioning earlier, is to identify what is the domain you want to get into, because getting into the space industry is one thing, but then getting into what domain of space industry is another important thing, because the masters is going to be defined by that. Because if you want to, become someone who wants to, manufacture spacecraft, that's kind of a general idea of what you want to do. But then operationally, it turns to someone who knows how to do systems engineering, and then you see how your profile matches with that. So I think that's probably the best way to go. You kind of see what your, profile is, and then you see what your interest is, and you kind of try to bridge the gap by either doing a master's, a full, 2-year master's, or, doing a summer program in, like ISU, International Space University, like I mentioned. So these are all things that, one needs to make the decision of how to connect the two bridges. For some people it's easier, for some people it's harder, and they may have to do a full master's course.
Yeah, now that you mention it, when I think about it within Europe, for example, there's a very strong presence of a lot of the Indian students having graduated from places like TU Delft or, TU Berlin or many other places, and, having ended up in places like ISI or, Rocket Factory Augsburg or ESAR Aerospace or many, many of these companies. So I think there's a fairly strong community, at least within Europe, at the moment, for a lot of the Indians, having entered the space industry very recently, right?
Yeah. No, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's again going back to, how they position themselves, and, they wanted to get into the space industry, and then they decided to specialize in, do a master's in, a space domain, a master's in space engineering in Delft or in TU Berlin. And then that automatically, introduce them to a community, because coming from, from another country, it's important to be aware of, what's going on in Europe. And of course, if you're coming from India, it's very hard to know that, a company called ISAR Aerospace or Rocket Factory Augsburg is recruiting. And you can only do that or know that only by being in, the local community, which is why it's important to, have a network that helps you get, to know the names and to know the requirements. So it's absolutely essential. And like you said, there are a lot of people who have done it, who are working in, launcher companies or spacecraft companies, or even exploration companies all around the world. But it started with them, kind of identifying where their interest is and then going after it. And yeah, so that's why it's important to do that. And Europe is again becoming a very, very interesting destination, simply because there's a lot of private companies, and there's also a lot of demand, and frankly there's just going to be more and more demand in the future, and it's only good that Indians can take advantage of that in Europe.
Yeah, there's one extreme set of people who are often, bombard messages saying, I want to be an astronaut at the end. So there's this group of people who also, I mean, it's not wrong to aim to be an astronaut by any means, but a lot of the nationality and a lot of the restrictions around it make it very, very hard to choose. Uh, I mean, what would be your advice to a lot of this kind of people who are, looking to pursue a career towards being an astronaut, but having to deal with a lot of restrictions from, being able to come from a background of, coming from India, for example?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. But I mean, first things first is, it's if you want to be an astronaut for a space agency mission, it's going to require a few years of your education and your training and your work experience. So in the 20s, it's probably going to be, it's probably going to be bad news for people, but in the 20s, it's probably going to be almost impossible to, even if you start very early, simply because, we are not belonging to the particular nationality. But even if you are, it's going to be, if you're a European or an American, unless you want to, go into a, like a suborbital mission from a Blue Origin or, things like that, it's still going to be very hard if you're in your 20s. But what you can do is, have a set plan, and the plan can be based on, where you come from and what you want to do in the future. Because if you want to be an astronaut, you have to specialize in one area, and you cannot do that unless you have a few years of experience. Because unless you're very, very kind of smart and you have a bachelor's degree before you finish, I don't know, 18. But realistically speaking, you need to do a bachelor's degree, and then if you're from India, then you need to move to a country of choice where you have a more likelihood of becoming an astronaut. That includes, there are not a lot of countries. To be honest, you can even just be in India and hope that in a few, 5-10 years, we will have a human space flight kind of industry going on. Right now, it's just going to be only restricted to professionals, at least for the Gaganyaan mission. But in Europe and in US and in Japan and in the UAE, 4 countries that I can think of. China, if you want to include 5. It's going to be very, very important for you to move there and become one of their own in order to be considered for their missions, because that's the only way that you can realistically kind of achieve your real astronaut ambition. If you want to move to the US, you finish your undergrad in India or do an undergrad in the US, try to become a European citizen or American citizen, and then do a PhD, which means that you specialize in a topic. Your specialization can be in biology, it can be in aerospace engineering, or in the pilot, the aviation side of things. So you need to specialize that. It can be in Europe, it can be in any country, but this is absolutely necessary, simply because we don't have the citizenship. So we need to move there, wait a few years, become a citizen, and then be considered. If you're really smart about it, I don't think it's impossible, because if one moves to Europe, let's say France or Germany, you can get a citizenship in 5 years, 5 to 7, 8 years, depending on which country you're in. And then you need to specialize in a particular domain. So if you give yourself kind of 10 years, it's not impossible for you to submit an application as a European for a European Space Agency mission. The same with NASA. It's not impossible that you cannot submit an application, but the reality is you need to become a citizen, and it's easier in some countries, easier, not easy in other countries, but the absolute requirement is for you to become a citizen, and it is going to remain that way, for the foreseeable future. So it's smart that you move to the country early on, start to blend in, decide to specialize in a particular topic, and then try to become an astronaut, or submit an application for an astronaut, because you need to first fulfill the main criteria that you're in good health and you're a citizen of this country. So it's important to kind of work towards that. Of course, I have seen there are other astronauts, simulation missions, those things. One can do that, but if you're happy to settle for that, you can definitely aim for that. There are things like POSUM, and there are things like the missions in Antarctica, in the Arctics, where you can go and kind of simulate, or even in US and Utah, which kind of simulates Mars. So Mars, they call it Mars missions, but at the end they are still simulation missions. But if you're happy to settle for that, you can still do that, but you need to pay for it, and you need to just go and do some research activities there and then come back. You can kind of think of that as kind of a way to quench your astronaut thirst. But then if you want to become like a real astronaut, I think going to the country and specializing in a topic, and then spending a few years working on your astronaut profile, and then submitting an application is what it is probably I can think of. I don't think there is anybody who has done that, but I don't think it's impossible. I don't know what you think, but it's pretty. It's it's not. Yeah, it requires 10 years. You need to get the citizenship, you need to speak the language, you need to kind of become a citizen of that country. But then, if at that point, if you're in good health and you're specialized in your field, then you can submit your applications. I mean, that's kind of my perspective. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think the same in that sense, where it becomes extremely difficult if you are not within, let's say, at the moment, for example, with the military in India to get selected for the astronaut corps, and it'll take a while for civilian astronauts to come up in India, and especially their roles should be somebody who's also possibly a civilian astronaut who is working for government institutions in India, not likely a private citizen or a private university or private research person.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I think that it's going to kind of become more and more interesting for civilians in the next few years, simply because there's going to be more and more people launching, and you know, not everybody needs to be, an Air Force pilot or an Indian Air Force pilot. I think that requirement is going to go away in the next few years. But yeah, if you're starting now, then your ambitions are realistically, 10 years away. You can kind of plan backwards for 10 years, because I think by 10 years time there's going to be some relaxation in rules, and a lot more people can start applying for it. It's in Europe it is already changing, in the US as well. Not everybody is an Air Force pilot in US, but that means that even normal civilians who have extremely good profiles have a chance. But then you should just work towards it. I think that's kind of the important bit.
So let's jump to the skill sets for some of the roles. And given that you have a background in the software industry and then consulting and so on, and you have an extensive background now in the Earth observation domain and so on, what do you think are some of the core skill sets that young people today should be focusing on to enter into the space industry?
Yeah, so from a skill set perspective, well, if you want to get into, well, if you look at the space industry in two ways. One is the upstream perspective, one is the downstream perspective. The upstream is, a lot to do with hardware, so a lot of engineering on, the mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, and electrical engineering, all that. So the upstream perspective requires, of course, you to have, the right technical skills. And if you want to get in there and you want to make a spacecraft, all that is very important in the upstream side. But then, going into what is the type of satellite you want to work on. If your background is in communications, then, you can work on communication satellites and, projects related to communication satellites. If your background is in instrumentation and remote sensing and all that, then of course you can go on and work on Earth observation payloads and also exploration payloads, because at the end of the day, a lunar mission with a spectrometer for monitoring is the same as an Earth observation mission monitoring the Earth. So if you have any sort of remote sensing skills uh, or instrumentation skills, they're going to be very, very useful in the upstream side. Or even if you're just a physics major, or if you just have a scientific background, it's still very important in the upstream industry to design future missions, on the upstream side of things. And yeah, I focus more on the downstream side of things, and simply because my background is in software, and I'm more focused on the application side. It's even more reachable for people. I feel the upstream is kind of limited for you to have a background or some skills. For the downstream, I think, depending on where your background is, it's very easy to get into the space industry from a downstream perspective. If you're an electronics and communications engineer, you can get into any communications company, any satellite operator who's making communication satellites, because I know plenty of people who just had a pure electronics and communications background, and they got into space companies, and simply because they just have the same skills that can be applied to a communication satellite. And it's even more easier if you have a background in data analysis and software, and if you are able to build a software. It's the same as building a product that is based on Earth observation data. Because I was mentioning in the beginning of the podcast, Earth observation is just another type of data, and people who are building products based on satellite data, they are still building a software product, meaning that you still need to know how to code. You still, need a front-end engineer, you need a back-end engineer, you need to have a database. It's all very similar to having a software background. So for people who want to get into the space industry and you have a software background, it's very, very easy. It's, you just apply your skills in building software, and you just try and know the basics of some sort of Earth observation, and then you get into the Earth observation industry and build products. And you can even diversify if you want into building flight software, avionics, and there's a lot more software components in the upstream world these days. So if you're in the software industry, you can even move and build softwares for rockets, for launchers, or for satellites, because they are becoming autonomous, more and more autonomous. So your software skills are actually going to be useful in both upstream and downstream. And it's kind of interesting that people don't connect the dots, but at the end of the day, you need to know the how a spacecraft works. Of course, if you're building a software and you have experience building a website, it's not going to be the same as you building a launcher software. But if you know the basics, and if you have a master's degree, or if you do a course in understanding the fundamentals of it, you can even kind of apply your skills there, because at the end of the day, they are going to build software, and the skills that are needed for building software are going to remain the same. And yeah, so it's easier if you have software skills actually to get into the space industry, because you can just come and apply your skills while knowing some fundamentals of space. So that's kind of how I would see it. And of course, there's there are other the other two domains that I talked about, the legal and the medicine. It's still tricky, but again, that is also something that you can get in. I know people who have been lawyers before, and they were just interested in space, and they decided to do a course or something about in ISU, or do a master somewhere, and then understand how the space industry works, and now they apply their lawyer skills in the space industry. So again, the law doesn't change, or the way you understand the law doesn't change, and there are going to be some lawyers needed to write more space policy for the future. And lawyer, if you have legal skills, and the same with medicinal skills, it's probably going to be a little important in India as well, because of Gaganyaan mission coming up. So if you're having some sort of medical skills, or skills as a doctor, then you can definitely diversify again into the space industry, because it's like it's a very exciting industry, because it's where all the skills kind of come together. Even if you're an artist, for instance, there are a lot of interesting aspects coming up, because people want to send their art to space, or people want to design architecture for spacecrafts, and for human rated flying missions, meaning you can get to if you're an architect, you can then apply your architecture skills for the space industry. So irrespective of the skills you have, it's just about how you want to try and use it. And that is, I think, the key point of getting into the space industry. Whatever skills you have, you just need to use it in a smart way.
I think one of the things that we possibly missed is the talk about potential scholarships for people, because there are, of course, a lot of scholarships in many other sectors or many other subjects and so on. Do you know like any space specific scholarships? Like for example, when I studied, I got the French government scholarship to study in France for my education in Europe, but I don't imagine there are very many of them.
There aren't particularly a lot specifically for space industry, but then if you want to go into a particular country, I think the country has quite a few scholarship. I think the relationship between India and France has been improving a lot in the last 3 years, and there are a lot more scholarships available for people for coming into France. And as you know, France is one of the big countries in Europe for space, and if you want to get into the space industry, you can come down to study in France, both from an engineering perspective or also from a business perspective. So there's a lot more scholarships available for France, and Germany as well. Germany has been an interesting destination. There has been some interest in Sweden and Italy as well for doing some master's courses, but the scholarships are less available. But I think the most scholarships are available, at least in my perspective, are in France and Germany, at least from a European standpoint. For US as well, it's kind of a different story because it's probably a little more expensive and different types of scholarships are available, but I don't think it's as much as what you would get in Europe. I think in Europe, France and Germany are probably the best countries to look out for. And the thing is, there's no space specific scholarships. It depends on the university. Maybe they have a scholarship. For example, ISU has a scholarship for people who want to come and study. And it's probably the same case for other universities, but not specifically for the space industry. Perhaps that's something that some universities will start to do in the next few years, because there's a lot more courses coming up. There's a new space masters that has been started in Luxembourg. There's another space masters that's from the Erasmus that is going on. So maybe there are a lot more going to come, a lot more scholarships going to come in the next few years.
Yeah, the one that I recently remember, which is quite interesting, is the Kalpana Chawla Scholarship for ISU for women from India.
Definitely, if you're interested to get into the space industry, and if you're a woman, then it's definitely something worth considering. But also, I have to say, it's getting more and more competitive, because there are only like 2, 3, or maximum 5 people that they can support, and I think it's getting very, very popular. So you need to have a very strong profile or a very good motivation to get in, because this is one of the very, very few scholarships available for space people.
Yeah, and today, as of now, the increasing requirements on the data, a lot of people, including Amazon, Microsoft, getting into the space industry. You have cloud, you have, artificial intelligence, machine learning, a lot of those things coming into the space industry now. So, what kind of roles, which will all of these open up for a lot of the people coming up? Because I'm sure that there's a lot of people in India who are, cloud specialists and intelligence and machine learning enthusiasts and so on. So, what are the kind of opportunities and that can bring to them, and what you see, as possibilities for them?
Yeah, it's a very exciting time to be, if you have some kind of skills in the software side of things. It can be in cloud, it can be in artificial intelligence, it can be just in data analysis as data scientist. It's the entry of the so-called big tech into the space industry is actually very, very interesting, because now you have all sorts of roles that you had only in the software industry also being opening up for space, for the space industry, because you have like a communications role. They're trying to build ground stations. So if you have some experience in the communications, electronics and communications industry, that can be one entry point for Amazon and Microsoft, because they're also starting to own and acquire ground stations for themselves. So there's the communication side of it, and of course the software side of it. If you have experience in working with cloud, or even working with AWS or Amazon, you can just apply your skills very directly for getting into Amazon or for Azure. Of course, it's still in the starting stage. I wouldn't say that there's a lot of jobs available for that. There's only very few this year, but in the next few years it's going to only get bigger and bigger, because people are going to use Amazon and Azure to develop solutions based on data from space. So it's only a matter of time before people who are able to build products based on cloud and artificial intelligence for another industry can also do it for the space industry now. So it's going to be very, very easy to apply your skills while working for them, or for another company that is also building solutions using cloud. Like I said, in the Earth observation domain, there are multiple companies who are building products, software products at the end, using Earth observation data, and they're all going to require people to know the cloud skills or artificial intelligence skills. And companies like ISI, if you go and look at ISI, they are even organizing webinars for people for people with software skills to get into the space industry. And the webinar is basically ISI telling people with software skills that they need them, and there's a lot of demand, and they just need to go and apply. And the requirement is just for them to know how to build a software product. So they have a full stack engineering experience, or a back end engineering, front end engineering, and ISI is ready to give them training on the space side of things. So the demand is still there. You just need to know how to build a software, and you have some at least a couple of years of experience to prove that. And yeah, companies are even ready to take you in, train you for what you need, and then get you to work. So it's becoming more and more accessible, especially for people with software skills.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty bright future in terms of jobs, as to what was maybe 10 years ago to what it is as far as today is kind of concerned, I guess. Uh, so, in all, I think today one of the missing aspects that I also see in a place like India is a lot of the business research community, even let's say maybe the IIMs or some of the more statistical driven institutes also, to use space data and also to use case studies from the space industry itself. Um, what can we do to encourage a lot of this, so that even a consulting firm like PwC or NSR or whatever it is, which have been in Europe and US, those kinds of consulting companies can be actually also created out of India.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's 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 not a completely different domain, and we have also a lot of case studies and needs actually to satisfy in India. So I think the key point is introducing this into the the education system, and having people think of space as not just exploration and going to Mars and Moon, and making it as important as any other industry in your case studies. If you're someone who's doing, who's in the business school, and you're having case studies in automotive, in manufacturing, or in e-commerce, or in software, I don't think the space industry should be, kind of excluded there, because now it is becoming an industry, so to say. It's not just a research domain; it's also becoming an industry now. So it should be, starting in the university side of things, so that people are starting to look at space as a place to work, or as a something that generates commerce, rather than just a research field, which is kind of how it has been kind of portrayed in India. A lot of people, I think, I'm sure, even from your side or from my side, they don't kind of understand what I do in the space industry, and a lot of people think I am working for NASA or for a space agency, and the kind of reach of people is not as much as you would expect. And I think it's simply because of the lack of exposure to the industrial standpoint. And I mean, the new space companies growing up in India is only going to change that, because I think people are starting to realize that there are companies that can be established. There can be, Team Indus was a good case study there, that there can be a company that can send you know spacecrafts to the moon. Or then companies today, Pexel or Agnikul or Dhruva or Bellatrix, and all the new space companies coming up, they're all kind of case studies of how you can actually start a company in the space industry, which is which was not possible, at least a few years ago. And these are all case studies that need to be established in the education system. But also, I think even after that, I think it's up to people to kind of realize that there's going to be a need. If there are plenty of places where you can go and ask for support if you want to start up a software company. I think it's just so many numerous places in India that are available to support you if you want to start up a software company. But for the space industry, I think they kind of lost. And I think there is definitely a need for people to just offer these services, because these are all just these are all just fact reports or fact checks, or service providers who just offer consulting. These are all ways that you can support the Indian industry, because there can be someone who's just interested in investing in space, and he doesn't know how the industry works, and he doesn't know how to invest in space. There are at least I can only think of a couple to three people who are investing in space industry in India, and I think there is a lot more people who can be interested in the space industry. It's just that they have nowhere to go to understand. So there's definitely a need to offer these services, to provide insights on what the space industry is, how does it work, where are the opportunities, why do you need to build a rocket, what is the demand for satellites, how much money you can make. All these are possible, services that one can start providing if one has the expertise already. So that's definitely a kind of a gap that India has. I think we are kind of dependent on the consulting reports and market reports from the Western companies, but there's also a need to do that specifically for the Indian ecosystem, because it's a huge ecosystem, and there's going to be a lot more demand coming up in the future. So it's necessary to specialize that, and there's definitely a gap that needs to be filled.
So, Arvind, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. What I will do is I will link your LinkedIn profile in the show notes of this episode, so that if people want to reach out to you, they can maybe send you a LinkedIn invite.
Sure. No, absolutely. Happy to help out.
And this has been a great episode, and thank you so much for spending an hours of your time to recording this. And I hope things go well for you as you enter from being an independent consultant to doing more and more in the space industry. And a lot of people can follow the footsteps that you have laid out for them to as an example as well. So thank you so much again.
Thanks, MP.